In this video, there will be a brief introduction to the immune system. So I'll just be doing a generalized introduction to the immune system and introducing you to some key terminology that you will need to know, that you'll need to be able to define and use when we're talking about the immune system later on. So when we talk about disease, usually disease comes under one of two categories: communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases. Communicable diseases can be passed on from one person to another, and these are usually caused by pathogens like bacteria, fungi, viruses, protists like parasites, or sometimes by prions. So all viruses are pathogenic. Viruses are obligate parasites. Some bacteria are pathogens, some fungi are pathogens, and some protists are pathogens. For instance, the organism that causes malaria, Plasmodium, is a protist. A prion-based disease is slightly different in that a prion is not a living thing that causes a disease. For instance, CJD, Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, or mad cow's disease, is caused by a prion, and it's essentially a misfolded protein that can cause like a cascade reaction to cause other proteins in cells to misfold, and then it can cause really serious consequences. So these are the usual things that cause communicable diseases. I'm just going to give you a definition of that word pathogen. A pathogen is any microorganism that can cause disease. And a non-communicable disease is a non-infectious condition that cannot be spread from person to person. These are usually conditions which can last a really long time, so they're often chronic. So, for instance, an example of a non-communicable disease might be cardiovascular disease, or cancer, or genetic diseases such as Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease. So going back to communicable infections, we know that our body has natural defense mechanisms. So we have both physical and chemical barriers to entry for pathogens. So let's just have a think about what they are. These tend to be non-specific things in the body. That means they will prevent anything from getting in. So we know that our airways, so our trachea, is lined with mucus and cilia. That mucus will trap any foreign particles, and then those cilia will waft by rotating in a rhythmical fashion, all that stuff up towards the back of the throat, where it will be swallowed down via the esophagus into the stomach, and where it will hopefully be destroyed by the hydrochloric acid of the stomach. We know that our mouth contains saliva, which contains lysozyme enzymes. This is an enzyme which acts as an antimicrobial agent, essentially by hydrolyzing the peptidoglycan bonds in bacterial cell walls, which leads to cell death through osmotic lysis. So water will pour into the bacterial cell and the whole thing will burst. So this lysozyme is found not just in your saliva, but it's also found in tears, and it's also found in breast milk. So this is a really important antimicrobial agent. We also produce lysozyme in our sweat for exactly the same reason. So we've also mentioned already that our stomach contains hydrochloric acid, which can kill any pathogens that we swallow with our food or drink. Then if we think about going down into our intestines, we know that our intestines contain millions and millions of bacteria. They're just lined with bacteria. These bacteria are often referred to as commensal bacteria. So they essentially cause us no harm at all. And they're actually very helpful in many ways. It's a whole topic in itself, studying gut microorganisms. But one of the main things they do is that they take up space and they outcompete pathogens. So there's no space or resources available for those pathogens to land and start to colonize the lining of your intestines. Your skin is tough and highly impenetrable. It's made of keratin, and it secretes sebum, which contains fatty acids and antimicrobial peptides, so molecules that will make it an inhospitable environment for the growth and colonization of microorganisms. Your skin is also covered in commensal bacteria, which both outcompete potentially pathogenic bacteria, so prevent them colonizing your skin, and produce substances which are toxic to any bacteria which might try and grow on your skin. So your skin is also dry. This creates a hostile environment for colonization by pathogenic microorganisms. This is why your internal membranes, your mucosal membranes, are much more likely to become colonized by microorganisms because they're moist. The other thing that the skin is very good at is rapidly repairing when it's wounded to prevent the entry of pathogens. So we are really good, if you have an abrasion or a cut, at forming scabs. The cells of your skin also have tight junctions. That means that they're really, really packed very tightly together. That means that it's much harder for things to get through. So we've talked about the eyes, sweat, the stomach, the intestines, your airways, your mouth, and your skin. We also mentioned that your breast milk also contains antimicrobial substances like lysozyme enzymes. And remember, a mother's breast milk also contains lots of really important antimicrobials like antibodies. So when a baby is first born, their immune system is not fully developed and they can't make their own antibodies. So breast milk also contains antibodies, which are really important for the health of newborn babies. If we think about the urinary tract, this is a mucosal membrane that is also at risk of infection. In general, the normal flow of urine washes out microorganisms that might enter the urinary tract. And the vagina has a pH of between 3.8 and 4.5, which is moderately acidic. And so this helps to prevent the colonization of the vaginal walls by any pathogenic bacteria. The vagina also produces a protective mucus that performs the same role as mucus everywhere else in the body in protecting against colonization by pathogenic microorganisms. So we've mentioned a few non-specific physical and chemical barriers. So if we look at them, we see that some might fall under both, like the skin falls under both a physical and a chemical barrier. Some are clearly chemical, like hydrochloric acid in the stomach. Some are biological, like enzymes, and our gut microbiome, our normal flora and fauna. And some are mechanical, like our cilia, and it is the movement of the cilia that generally protects our lungs from infection. And we know that if we smoke, for instance, that can paralyze our cilia, and so we don't have that wafting action, and so our lungs become more at risk of respiratory infections. So how are microorganisms transmitted from one organism to another? This could be through direct contact, through touching, through inanimate objects. So a microorganism could be living on an inanimate object that you touch, like clothing or the floor or a table or a cup. When you have transmission through an inanimate object, this is often referred to as fomite infection. Infections can be transmitted via vectors. A really good example of that is malaria. So, for instance, somebody could have the malarial parasite in their bloodstream. They could get bitten by a mosquito that would take the malarial parasite into its own gut. And then when that mosquito bites somebody else, it transmits that malarial parasite to a second person. So a vector is when another organism transmits it from person to person. It could be a droplet infection. So, for instance, a viral infection like the flu, when you sneeze or cough, it comes out in an aerosol, in a droplet in the air, and then it can be inhaled. It could be ingested. Many bacteria are ingested in our food, like, for instance, salmonella or cholera. Or it could be inoculation. So you could get it, for instance, through blood contact or contact of bodily fluids, for instance, HIV. One common error that students sometimes make is by thinking that the pathogen is the disease. Pathogens cause disease. They are not diseases in themselves. So when we think about the stages of an infection, a pathogen needs to get into your body. So we talked about ways that could happen. So it could enter via airways, it could enter via a wound, it could be ingested, or it could enter across a mucous membrane. Once it has entered, it has to colonize an area, i.e., it has to be able to undergo rapid cell division. One bacterium is not going to make you sick. One virus is not going to make you sick. It's when those pathogens have had time to undergo cell division, and now there are loads and loads of them. In order for colonization to be successful, that pathogen has to have a way of avoiding the host defense systems, i.e., of not getting destroyed by your barriers so they can get in, and then maybe not getting destroyed by your immune system once they are in. Then why do you actually get sick? There are two reasons that you get ill. One, the pathogen might be toxic in some way. So, for instance, it might produce a toxin that inhibits the function of cells or kills host cells. An example of that could be, for instance, the botulinum toxin, which is produced by Clostridium botulinum in the case of a disease called botulism. So you can most commonly get botulism by eating improperly canned food in which this Clostridium botulinum has grown, but it could also come in through an infected wound. It often then grows in the intestines and will produce this toxin. The botulinum toxin prevents the release of acetylcholine from the end of nerve endings, and this causes essentially paralysis. Its symptoms can be really far-reaching, and it can actually be quite hard to diagnose. So its symptoms are usually to do with problems with muscle control, so double vision, blurred vision, slurred speech, eventually difficulty in swallowing, and eventually it can get involved in the muscles involved with the respiratory system, and you can have difficulty breathing. So it can become quite dangerous quite quickly. Another example of a bacterial toxin is the Clostridium tetani toxin. So Clostridium tetani is a soil bacterium, and it causes tetanus. So if you get it in a wound, like an open wound, it can produce a toxin called tetanospasmin, which essentially interferes with motor neurons. It leads to widespread activation of motor neurons and spasming of muscles throughout the body. These muscle spasms generally begin at the top of the body and move down, beginning about 8 days after your first infection with lockjaw, followed by spasms of the abdominal muscles and the limbs, and this can continue for several weeks. So tetanus can be a really, really dangerous and deadly condition. Now, these bacteria aren't trying to produce these toxins to kill you. It's just that these are natural chemicals that they release as part of their normal metabolism. So, for instance, if we think about this tetanus toxin, it's thought that this enables the Clostridium tetani to establish the infection within the wound, i.e. to be able to colonize its new habitat. And so we can't imagine that these bacteria are trying to cause us harm. It's just as a byproduct of them living in us, we get caused harm. The other reason that pathogens can cause disease is, rather than producing toxins, it's their level of invasiveness, i.e. if an organism can grow in a host tissue to such large numbers that it starts to inhibit host function, then it causes harm. So a really good example of that would be pneumonia. So just a couple more things before we finish off. First of all, let's talk briefly about what is the function of the spleen. So the spleen is one of those organs that people don't talk about that much, but the spleen has different jobs depending on the different time of your life. So before you're born, when you're a fetus, the spleen is responsible for producing red and white blood cells. Shortly before birth, the spleen loses this ability and the bone marrow takes over. When you're an adult, the spleen is involved in filtering the blood. So when blood flows through your spleen, white blood cells found in the spleen attack and remove any foreign organisms. This keeps your blood clean and it helps to protect you against infection. So people who have their spleen removed are more at risk of infection. In general, other organs, such as the liver, can take over most of the spleen's functions. So you'll be able to cope with most infections. There's just a slightly increased risk. So we've covered a number of key introductory ideas in this video, and it's really important that you take your time to get your head around some of these new key terms in order to prepare you for the next part of the course.